Good morning, everyone, and if you'll take your places, we will get started on our meeting today, Thursday, January the 16th, 2020, new year, new decade. This meeting of the Municipal Solid Waste Management and Resource Recovery Advisory Council. I want to welcome everyone here today, and as is custom, I would like to begin with introductions both on the council and with the audience. So if we'll start on my left, Jim.
Commissioner Wolverton, representing Guadalupe County and counties under 130,000 population.
Maurice Betts, Lee County Commissioner, representing counties of any size.
Cheryl Murga, Houston Galveston Area Council, representing a planning region.
Scott Pasternak with Burns and McDonnell, representing the general public.
Richard McHale with the City of Austin, representing City or County Solid Waste Agency.
Dave Yankee with New Gen Strategy Solutions, representing the financial community.
I'm Holly Holder with Park Hill Smith & Cooper in Lubbock, and I represent licensed professional engineers working in the solid waste industry.
Good morning. I'm Chuck Rivette. I work for Waste Management of Texas. I represent a solid waste professional with experience managing a commercial solid waste facility.
Trip Perez, City Council Member, City of Pearland, representing cities over 75,000 population.
Good morning, Scott Trebus. I work with Republic Services, and I'm representing Solid Waste Management organization composed of primarily commercial operations.
Judge Dillard, Concho County, representing our populations under 50,000.
Good morning. My name is Earl Lott. I'm the Director of the Waste Permits Division with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality.
Chance Gooden, MSW Permit Section with the TCEQ.
Kristen Hernandez, Municipal Solid Waste Permits.
Diane Barnes, MSW Permit Section.
Jeff Mayfield, North Texas Municipal Water District. I represent public solid waste districts or authorities.
Gene Mueller with the TCQ Waste Permits Division.
David Greer with the External Relations Division.
Charlie Fritz with the TCQ Waste Permits Division.
Burgess Stengel with Civil and Environmental Consultants.
Ken May with Capillary Council of Governments.
Steve O'Dill, MSW Permits.
Bria Patterson, MSW Permits.
Barbara Coombs, Environmental Benchmarking with over 10 years experience with the recycling industry.
Jenny Lewis Ford with the Texas Association of Regional Councils.
Santos Olivares Waste Permits Division.
Cheryl Untermeyer with TCQ Waste Permits.
Ryan Rutledge, Litigation.
David Barrera, City of Kerrville Public Works.
Larry Lane, Texas Disposal System.
And one more, as soon as Heather gets settled.
Hi, I'm Heather Douglas. I'm here representing a conservation company nonprofit for State of Texas Alliance for Recycling. And I just drove in from Dallas. So.
Okay, great. Glad everybody made it in, made it safe. So, as I said, again, welcome. And at this time, I will turn it over to Earl Lott for the Waste Permit Division update. Earl?
Well, thank you, Holly, and Happy New Year, everyone. I don't think we've had a meeting since last year, so good to see everyone's face. To start off, one of the things that we've got going in the Waste Permits Division, and this was part of my New Year's, I guess, resolution for the division. I wanted to improve our level of outreach and public education, and we're starting off with some of our, what I see as tend to be more controversial type applications that we have. As y'all know, we also authorize medical waste facilities, and we've had a number of medical waste processing facilities come in for authorization over the past year. And those applications seem to be more and more controversial. And I think a lot of it is a lack of education on what these type of facilities really are and what they entail. And what we're doing is working with our external relations department, and we're going to do a series of videos, kind of like YouTube videos, basically going through a medical waste facility from start to finish of operations, and just showing exactly what occurs at those. Because many of these facilities, as y'all know, are no different than walking into a drugstore. I mean, you would see that sort of material if you were to go into a CVS or a Walgreens. You know, a lot of times they're just taking expired pharmaceutical drugs. Now, don't get me wrong, some of them do work with hospitals, and they'll take stuff like actual medical waste, which includes gauze and things of that nature. But, you know, it all comes in red boxes, and it usually goes into the facility for processing. It goes through a autoclave or some sort of disinfectant process, and then it's further processed and then final disposition. So we're working on that, and I think over the next month we will be starting to actually go out and do video shoots. And we'll host these videos on our website, on the agency website, and put them out there as a reference. And then we'll probably expand on that to some other type of authorizations that we permit in this division. And it's more than anything, it's just for education and outreach purposes, so they know exactly what type of operations they are. You know, the reason we chose medical waste also is we've gone to some public meetings, and you know, there was a significant interest in these operations. And you know, once we got there and explained what the facility was doing, it was like, well, oh, I didn't realize that's what this type of facility was. So we thought if we be a little more proactive, maybe that will help expand the education out there. Let's see, some other things that I guess y'all were interested in from the last meeting was update on Fund 5000. For fiscal year 2019, Fund 5000 collected $33.9 million in tipping fees. And of that, $22.7 million was directed to Fund 549 for the operation of the programs, which includes the Municipal Solid Waste Program. It also, a small portion of it goes to Radioactive Waste Division, Industrial Hazardous Waste, as well as the Voluntary Cleanup Program. However, the lion's share of that funding, the $22.7 million, goes to MSW program to fund the operations. Let's see, further breakdown of that $33.9 million that was collected in tipping fees, $11.2 million of it goes into Fund 5000. And then from that $11.2 million, $5.5 million per year is appropriated to the councils of government. And lastly, the overall balance of Fund 5000 at this time is approximately $112 million. Any questions on the fund?
I don't do math very quickly, but so 11.2 million goes to the Fund 5000 and 5.5 million goes to the COGS. What happens to the balance?
The balance is unappropriated funding.
Okay.
Oh, and Chance just told me there's a handout in the packet that kind of explains that.
So with the balance at basically 10 times what you allocated this year, is there a specific plan for how we spend down the balance, or is it just rainy day funds or emergency use funds? Is that its purposefulness?
Well, since that is unappropriated, it sits in a comptroller's account. It can only be utilized by, or if the legislature were to appropriate that.
So right now, we're just waiting for the legislature to come up with an idea how to appropriate it.
Right. I think a couple of sessions ago, the legislature did take action to reduce the tipping fees to reduce the amount of growth in that account. And it has come down some over the years, but like I said, it's still 112 million.
If we were to advocate for the use of those funds for anything in particular, would TCQ have any opinions about where that could best be utilized? Is there something that's typically underfunded that we could try and maybe talk to our legislators about and say, can we get this money to move over in this area?
You know, to answer your question, Trent, we typically don't lobby for anything with the legislature. We're forbidden from doing that. Now, if we were asked as a resource to confirm or provide any additional information on any questions they may have on how those funds were to be appropriated, we would be happy to assist in answering those.
Maybe if I could be more creative, is there a particular function of TCQ that we would define as most underfunded?
No, that's a loaded question. You know, let me give an example. So last session, there was a bill that increased the number of full-time employees for additional waste investigations. So I think there was a bill that was passed, and then we got an additional 8 FTEs that went to our Office of Compliance and Enforcement for field investigators. So, and they have hired additional investigators. And the purpose of that was to get out to regulated municipal solid waste facilities more often on a more regularly scheduled inspection.
Yeah, well, I'm confident that Maurice and Cheryl would lobby that we increase or go back to the previous funding level that the COGS had before it was reduced. From my memory, the fund has not been used regularly over the years, but the last real big use of it was to clean up abandoned site, a battery site or something like that. Is my memory right? The interstate
there have
battery?
been some riders passed.
Right.
There was some of the funds used for to clean up a site. I think in the past, I mean, this was before my time, certain amount of the funds were used to help clean up an unauthorized tire site.
Right.
So
that's my memory about the primary use of the fund has been after orphan facilities that they didn't have any other funding for to go after.
Now, during fiscal year 2018, I think the governor has the authority to utilize those funds in whatever means necessary, and I think a portion of it was taken out of that fund for Texas Department of Emergency Management to use for Hurricane Harvey cleanup, and all of those funds were not expended, so that money came back to the account.
I believe it was like 90 million he designated, and it was to help the local governments with their match, and it wasn't all required, but it was going back again to help local governments reduce their cost.
Well, when you see the end of year balances, at the end of fiscal year 18, it was only 50 million. And the end of fiscal year 19, it's back to 112 million. So
that's the reason for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I could I'll just say for personal experience, and we're here to try and help the TCU board make recommendations, and possibly go into our own local communities with our own connections and talk about things that are important to this committee. I would certainly say, from my own personal experience, I feel for the organization because I know that when we've had to deal with things in Pearland with on the investigative side, you guys were really working very hard, but you could tell that they were underfunded and they were stretched pretty thin, and it tends to add stress to the entire investigative process. I would certainly like to advocate that we apportion this money to better fund those possibly some grant programs that for some of the local governments to help combat and get y'all information so there's better monitoring, and then I knew it. We're still waiting on FEMA to reimburse us for our Hurricane Harvey cleanup. A large of it was the the trash pickup. And, you know, we're a fairly well-resourced city, so we can advocate for ourselves, but I know there's a lot of communities out there that struggle with that. That may be a good use of those funds, either to compensate the reimbursement or to temporarily allow them to get the reimbursement and wait for them to get a refund when FEMA does get their portions in, or just help those guys outright.
Okay. Just one comment. I think the regional councils would be supportive of any effort to get additional funding. I know Maurice worked pretty diligently a few sessions back on attempting to do that.
Absolutely. I'm on the Almere Council Government Board, and with open arms, we'll accept whatever you want to give us.
Right. And I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I see Jenny Lewis, Executive Director of Texas Association of Regional Councils, and they work very hard at doing that. So maybe y'all need to visit afterwards.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, we all have each other's email, and I certainly don't want to put staff in an awkward position advocating for something. I'm sure that if I had them over a beer, they would tell me this is where we need the money, but this is a recorded meeting. But maybe if, you know, as we're starting to gear up into talking to our representatives before the next legislative session, perhaps if we are all on the same page about what we wanted to advocate for, we could all have an internal debate, have a uniform voice, go talk to our board, let them know that what we want to advocate, and then go out and talk to our representatives and say we are all on board with this recommendation. And you know, I really personally I hate to see unused money in government. When I know, having worked for government for quite a while, that there's every department, nearly every department is understaffed and overutilized, and if we have money that's sitting there that we could use to kind of combat things that we know are systemic problems, I think we need to try and find out where we can get that money and try and get it there.
Following up on that, do you know what the agency's timeline is for the LRA? When they have to submit that, their legislative?
The LAR?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, dyslexic.
You know that.
I really am.
Charlie Fritz keeps up with that, so.
Charlie Fritz, Assistant Director in Waste Permits Division. The LAR, going into the budget cycle, we'll start the LAR and the budget in probably this summer, doing most and having that ready by the fall before session starts.
So if I worked with my COG colleagues, that maybe we could have MSWRRAC look at a recommendation at the April meeting?
That would be, yes, because we start going through getting recommendations, additional funding requests, all that, starting in the summer.
Okay, thank you.
Cheryl, would that be something you would send out to all the COGs? Or?
Yes, I work through the elected officials.
Okay. Notice here, Earl, thank you, Charlie, good to see you. So this still goes back to fiscal year 2012. What year was it that the funds were, I guess, slowed down as far as going to COGS? Because these are all these are pretty consistent.
I don't recall the session. It was 2013?
2013.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Charlie. And so I guess fiscal year 20 would just be a duplication of more or less of what 19 was allocated.
Right. Should be pretty
Forward.
close.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions?
I just had a quick question. Didn't the 5,000, I know the 5,000 funds sometimes can be controversial for, you know, where the monies are going or if they're being used for solid waste activities, but weren't some of them also used for some of the tire cleanups? And Trent, you were talking about how those monies could be used. It seems like the tire cleanups continue to be an issue. And so haven't some of those funds been used in the past few years?
They have. That's what I was mentioning earlier, that I think, I do not recall the session, but there was fund from 5,000 appropriated to clean up a abandoned tire site in Atlanta, Texas, and something to the tune of $5 million, I want to say. And so, yes, if that is something on their radar that they want to focus on, then, you know, the legislature could appropriate that funding. And just let you know, we'd be a strong advocate for our tire cleanups because it continues to be a problem. Now, we have since you brought up tires, we've done a lot of legwork. We've got Gene Mueller, he's sitting on the front row here. He leads up that tire program, and we moved that over from Office of Compliance and Enforcement a couple of years ago. But we have done a lot of legwork to clean up the tire program and the records and reporting and things of that nature. And every session, there's been a bill related to tires and on how they're managed and final disposition, but those bills have not been successful in the past. With that said, Gene and his folks, as well as myself, we worked closely with EPA Region 6 to get some sort of relief on how tires can be used as a fuel for cement kilns. And that's really one of the most appropriate methods for disposing of unauthorized tires. At this point, we are just waiting on funding for cleanup because we still have, what is it, approximately 12 million tires throughout the state at unauthorized sites, Gene?
Yeah, about 14 million.
Or 14 million, yeah. So,
14 million primarily on 3 sites? Is that what you said?
no.
103 sites, okay.
Right. And I think over the last year, we cleaned up 2 million, or a little over 2 million, which is, it's a success. It's not the total 14, but got to start somewhere.
If I could pose a question to those that are in the waste management industry, with the concerns coming down the pipe about us losing a customer base for our recycling, recycled products, I mean, would there be some advocacy of trying to use Fund 5,000 for subsidizing that to continue to allow or divert there's some of the recycled material from going in the landfill until we find a permanent customer or until we find some way to process it locally? Or is that just not enough money for a project of that scale?
Okay, he moved it to me. Trent, I have to think about that as a very general rule. I don't want to say always, but a general rule. We like to see recycling support itself on its own economic merits. We support the STAR program that was advocated in the legislator push for looking for bringing in more industry into the state that would use our recycled products. The history of subsidizing recycling is not a good one, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a prop. And we do better when we find ways to recycle smart and have it make its own economic merit. To that extent, you know, there's still a bunch of recycling going on. It's not as profitable as it used to be. It may not be profitable at all. And, you know, cities like yourselves and all have seen that where you used to be able to recycle for free.
Yeah.
Now you can't recycle for free. Now you have to pay some amount of the weight for recycling. But the recycling, you know, those options are still there, very, very much so. So let me think about what you said and see. The one other thing on the Fund 5,000, it's not the only fund with a balance in it. The telephone balance is huge. And the one of the issues that runs into, everyone looks at the fund and says, well, we should use it. But the controller uses the balance in not only this fund, but all the other funds. And Cheryl, it adds up to like $1 trillion or something like that. It's some crazy number. They use that to balance the budget, right? So if you just start taking it out and you say, I'm going to deplete all the funds, then the legislature is left with the awkward task of increasing taxes by $1 trillion. And they're kind of loath to do that, as you know.
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
I'm sorry, I have to make one last comment. I think maybe a better use of the funds would to continue to give it back to the local governments, those who are operating recycling, to increase their usage, to get more volume coming in, clean, uncontaminated material, strengthen partnerships that they're great public-private partnerships, and then kind of reduce or increase the efficiency, both by the local government and any way we can help the privates. I think that would be a better use than subsidizing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I was not to split hairs, it's a subsidy unto itself. It's locally administered. And I know one of the things we've talked about is the issues concerning the contamination, the recycling, and cities like ours, we have a fairly robust recycling center. It's fairly well managed, but it's still understaffed, and we don't have people that can go through and say, I'm peeling this label off this tin can, I'm pulling this bottle out of this, or this plastic bottle out of this pile of glass to reduce the contamination. I mean, maybe that's a thought. If we could subsidize for staff that can, focus on removing the contaminants so we get cleaner recycling, and then have a better customer base. I mean, we're spitballing. I probably could do it the rest of the day, so I don't want to take over the meeting, so I apologize.
Yeah, I would just say, building on what Chuck said and Cheryl, I agree with them. A lot of our clients, and I know Scott's firm, they're wrestling with the recycling issues, and the best thing to know is what your options are, what they cost, and then educate your elected officials. But yeah, pulling money for a subsidy it's a little risky to do that. It's just better that the elected officials for the local community know what it costs for the recycling program, what the current markets are, and just are they willing to pay for that? That's what we found works.
Does anyone else have anything for Earl on Fund 5000?
Thank you for the update.
Yeah, thank you for the update. Yeah, Earl. So I think you can always bring up money, and that really gets a lot of excitement in the discussion.
It always does. Okay, a couple of other things. I don't want to take up too much time. I know I've exceeded my allotted time frame, but I've got a couple of more things I want to just mention to y'all. As y'all are probably aware, we've discussed it in previous meetings. There was 3 bills that were passed last legislative session. There were House Bill 1331, which raises the permit application fee from $150, which it is currently, to $2,000. House Bill 1435, that requires us to do site visits prior to permitting any new or expanding permits. And that's a practice that Chance and his staff have been doing anyway over the past couple of years, so it just memorializes it in statute. And then House Bill 1953, which exempts pyrolysis facilities that recycle plastics. And those bills will be going to our commission agenda for proposal on April 8th. And there will be a public hearing on May 19th. And the comment period will end on May 26th. And our goal is to have those bills adopted well before the end of the year.
Fiscal year?
Yes, this year. Yeah. And one more thing, I wanted to continue on my New Year's resolution list. One of the things that we've adopted in this division, Waste Permits Division, as well as in the agency, is what's called a Lien Process. And Lien is a tool that was derived in the Japanese auto industry, and it was very successful at Toyota and different manufacturing facilities at streamlining processes. Now, EPA adopted this a couple of years back in a lot of their processes, and it is shown to be very beneficial to them at really working to streamline processing. We are probably at the forefront in the agency on adoption. We're doing this across the board in the agency for our different processes, but I think Waste Permits is a little bit ahead of schedule on implementing that. And one of the things that we've done over the past year, and let me give some kudos while I'm doing that, Charlie Fritz is leading it for our division and really keeping us organized and on our toes on how we get this thing implemented. Our goal at the beginning of this year was to reduce our processing times by 50%, which is pretty significant. Our permit processing time frame for our municipal solid waste permit is about 350 days, so we're cutting that in half. It's a goal. It's a pretty aggressive goal, but we're making good progress on getting there, and Chance and his team have done a whole lot there. And the reason I bring that up to y'all, it's going to affect all authorizations that we process in the Waste Permits Division. And, you know, as a result of this, we're going to come up with new applications and ways of requesting information. And I want to just mention this because it's going to put a lot more pressure on applicants as well. Because Chance has got these performance boards laid out, and there's certain milestones that they have to hit. Everything from the administrative review to the technical review to the processing of notice of deficiencies. That's where we ask for additional information. We're going to hold applicants very much accountable to meet our deadlines. Now, I realize that there are certain things in the permitting processes that are completely out of our control and out of y'all's control, but we're going to work to, and the way this tool works, you document any type of hiccups or obstacles in meeting those goals. And you involve every layer of management in the agency pretty much to help you address those. I know a lot of that is going to come down to rule changes to where we change some rules along the way. But don't be surprised if, you know, you have something as simple as a composting authorization pending and you get a call from a director or above saying, hey, we need to get this moved, or you need to withdraw it and resubmit at a later date. That's just what we're trying to do, because, you know, a lot of times it's unfair. We get beat up a lot. Well, why is it taking you so long to process an application? We've given you additional resources. We've given you tools, but it's still taking you all this time. Well, some factors are completely out of our control. And one thing I want to mention that is a huge one, and we've already identified it, is the coordination piece on all permits. You know, I think you're required for a municipal solid waste type authorization, you're required to coordinate with like 12 or even more other outside entities like Federal Emergency Management Association or Federal Aviation Administration, Parks and Wildlife, all these different entities. And that coordination piece can create a significant bottleneck for us. So we are really doing a lot of brainstorming to try to figure out how to address that. And there'll be more to come, I'm sure. Because when we start looking at the numbers and what's hindering our success from meeting our goals, then, you know, we're going to work to remove those barriers. But anyway, any questions on Lien?
Is it L-E-A-N? Just
L-E-A-N,
Lien?
yes.
Yeah.
It was one of my personal goals for this year, but I haven't quite gotten there.
Well, you know, just speaking from experience, you know, we're seeing that in place now. I can tell a big difference between what it was, you know, 5 and 10 years ago, because it is moving faster. And, you know, you might want to think about that note in the letter where it says, you know, you must respond within 30 days of the date of this letter, because the time it leaves you guys' office and we get it, sometimes it's 10 days or more.
So are you okay with us putting 15 days in there?
I'd like to tell you, if you're going to, you know, sometimes we get emailed, and that really helps.
Right.
Because we get a good jump on it, but sometimes we don't. And so then we get that letter and we have 10 days to get it back by the date of the letter, so.
Right. Well, that's good to hear, Holly, because it's really, this whole tool is kind of it's a culture shift too.
Yeah.
It's a complete culture change.
Well, that's been in those letters for, I would say, decades.
Right.
So it's one thing, but it is definitely an improvement, so kudos to the staff.
I'd just like to echo what Holly has said in that, you know, we've seen big improvements already, but just the ability to get correspondence to us as it's written by email, rather than waiting for it to finally make its way through the mailroom, you know, by snail mail, that makes more difference than anything. And on the coordination piece, you're absolutely right. That's the bane of my existence, doing permitting, and probably a lot of other people's too. And some of those agencies just never respond. You know, what are you going to do? So thank you for tackling that one.
While you've got the microphone, Risa, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and who you represent?
I'm sorry, I was a little bit late with the rain driving down here. I'm Risa Weinberger, and I am representing composters and environmental educators with Risa Weinberger and Associates.
Okay. Holly, I have one last thing I wanted to mention. I would like the advisory committee to consider hosting a kind of a training at the next meeting, or just for outreach to all the, really the municipal solid waste universe. What we're trying to do is get some direction out there to all the municipal solid waste facilities on how to handle emergency declarations. As y'all know, over the last year, we've had some significant rainfall events. I think the last one in the Houston area was Tropical Storm Imelda, which dumped over 50 inches of rain in a short amount of time. And what that creates is a situation where, you know, a lot of the facilities are flooded or experience the roadways getting there are flooded, or, you know, and really we want to give some direction to the industry on how to handle situations like that. Because a lot of times the regional folks will, you know, they will coordinate, the facilities are coordinate with the regions, and they're asking for enforcement discretion or some sort of temporary authorization. And I know a lot of the facilities coordinate with Chance and myself, and we issue temporary authorizations to suspend certain activities. Because during a storm, you can't, you know, your leachate management system, your daily cover operations, a number of issues that are just going to cease for the moment. And our main objective is to ensure that that facility is protected and that you're helping get the community back on track with garbage disposal. Because what we see in all of these events is it impacts waste. You know, whether it's flooding or any kind of big storm event, you're going to have waste that's generated, and it has to go somewhere. So our goal is to get these facilities back on track as quickly as possible. But I think there's a lot of confusion because a lot of times we get an emergency declaration by the governor, and basically there are certain authorizations that you can suspend for a period of time in order to get your operations back on track. But then we have a lot of facilities that call us and ask for some sort of authorization, and we will process them immediately. You know, Chance and his staff work great on turning around temporary authorizations, and, you know, he emails them in a matter of minutes. But I think just to clarify how that process works would be good. So if there's no opposition to that, or
No, what would you envision is in conjunction with this meeting, or?
yeah, or I mean, if we
second
need
day,
to facilitate a stakeholder meeting, that's okay too. Aside from this, I guess I'm open to ideas or suggestions, but I really like to hit the waste industry in particular. And it's not just isolated to the Gulf Coast region. I mean, a few years ago, we had some significant fires in the Panhandle. So there was some need for relief at the waste facilities in West Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
oh yeah,
or hurricanes or tornadoes.
Tornadoes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to say tornadoes in the Dallas area recently is a good example. It's not just the Gulf.
Right. So I don't know, whatever's the best way to get the word out. You know, it's not going to be a real lengthy meeting, but I do expect to have Office of Compliance and Enforcement along with my folks in explaining what to do in these events and what happens when the governor issues an emergency declaration. What does that give you relief from? And which issues do you need to contact the agency for some direct guidance?
Well, one of the advantages of this meeting is it's broadcast. And, you know, if we have a separate stakeholder meeting, then maybe it's not broadcast. Maybe you just have to show up. If we have to allocate a reasonable chunk of time out of our meeting, I would advocate that. And I know we have our meetings from 10 to 12 for the most part now, and that's for good reason. But it's not going to break our back if we have to go to 12:30 either, right? And we will today, yeah. I would advocate making it as core part. The agenda gets viewed pretty widely by people. We may want to send a separate note out to operators, but it's broadcast. People can log in. It's got a lot of benefits in that regard.
And one of the things I hadn't thought about until today was, does it impact like composting operations or recyclers? Or
Yes.
okay, so it's a pretty broad invite. It sounds like. So
I'm like Chuck. If it's viewed as something that important, you know, I think we could certainly host it with this meeting, and you know, we've in the past broken for lunch and reconvened, so that's not unheard of on this advisory council. And maybe we could make the stakeholders meeting, maybe that's one of the first things that we do, and then work that through and then go into this meeting afterwards. That way they would know that it, like Chuck said, they could get on their computer if they can't make it here. At least they know at 10 a.m. is when the stakeholders meeting is going to start or soon thereafter.
Okay. And let me talk to my staff and see if we can, get some sort of special announcement sent out for that next meeting if y'all are okay with entertaining that idea. So.
All right. Is that all right with everyone else on the yeah.
Okay, I'm done.
I'm seeing thumbs up, so. That's all right. You've been short a few times, so you had that time in the bank.
It makes it up.
Well, so Chance, ball's in your court.
Oh, thank you. Before I begin, we still have a little bit more update for bill implementation, and we didn't really put it as a line item for David Greer to come up, but I know a few folks want to hear about the recycling feedstock study that's going on. So David, would you mind coming up and giving them up to speed on that? Thanks.
Thank you. Give it a second. For the record, I'm David Greer with the Public Education Section, the External Relations Division. I got updates for you on Senate Bill 649 and Senate Bill 1376. I'm going to start with that one. As it went to agenda yesterday for proposal purposes, the rulemaking project, we are proposing to add subsection 200 to 328, so it'll be 328.200. Implements those requirements required in Senate Bill 1376 that made changes to legislation from the 90s regarding municipalities and local governments, state government facilities requirement to have recycling processes in place, adding those additional exemptions. And then for the purchasing requirements associated with, the purchasing preference associated with municipalities and local governments requirement for recycled content products. The timeline for that, we hope that it will go to the Texas Register published in the Texas Register on January 31st. There is a anticipated public hearing date of February 27th at 10 a.m. in this room, I believe, and then with public comment period ending March 3rd, 2020, and hopefully going to adoption in June, on June 10th. For the update on Senate Bill 649, we are still in the process of trying to award a contract to carry out that project. I'll probably jinx myself. I've got my fingers crossed, but hopefully in the next 24 hours, one of those groups that submitted a bid to carry out that work will receive a contract that they can look over finally, and we will go forward with that if all goes well. So hopefully that will be in place very near future. Any questions, other concerns, updates? Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David. Okay, I'll give you my routine update that I normally do, but I'm going to defer the two bullets that you see on the agenda to more qualified staff to discuss. So my normal update about staffing, you have the org chart in your folders. You'll see a vacancy there. We actually have another vacancy. The org chart hasn't been updated since we recently got another person that has decided to move on to bigger and better opportunities. So I have two vacancies. I have a engineer specialist and then an engineer position that is currently vacant. Since we met last, those three vacancies that I had at the last meeting, I have filled those vacancies. One of them, Bria, she's here. You heard her introduce herself a while ago. The other two, Cody and Lee, that filled those positions, are currently in training today. So we're always moving around in my section. Since we last met, we had about 31 projects, major projects that are moving along. This time today we have 26, so we've moved a few since we last met, so that's good. That's all I'm going to give you an update on, unless you have something specific. I'm going to defer those two bullet items to Diane Barnes, and then Steve O'Deal is here to give you some discussion on the waste acceptance plan form and where we are. And I know that some of you have provided comments and can continue to provide comments on that, but we were anxious to get that published and out for you. So Diane, I'll let you give an update on yours.
Thank you, Chance. Good morning. I just wanted to reach out to let y'all know that the annual recycling report is due. TV recycling reports are due by the end of January 31. For the TV recyclers themselves, we only have about 6 currently registered, so that's all I have calling in. And then in David Greer's shop, they've got the TV manufacturers will be responding as well, reporting by the end of the month. And that's really all I have, unless y'all have any questions.
All right, great. O'Deal, would you mind coming up? Excuse me, Steve O'Deal.
Good morning. Sorry, that's louder. You'll find a copy in your package for the Type 1, Type 1AE Waste Acceptance Plan form. This is draft, proposed. The goal of this is to address the requirements of 33061B, 1, but which will fall into the streamlining. It will simplify the clarification of what wastes are coming to your facility and what will they be stored, will they be processed, will they be disposed. Trying to address, we pulled in some of the general prohibitions from other sections. I probably over-referenced it, but the references are intended to provide the definition for each of these and the rule that clarifies how they can be accepted at these facilities. And my hope was that not only would this allow us to write fewer NODs and to streamline our process, but that it would also provide a single document that reviewers, the public, and the agencies that receive copies of this for review would all be able to go to find out this basic information. It's always been a challenge to, in most of the applications I've received, it takes a while to figure out precisely what's going on at the facility, and having it all up front where it's described will simplify that process as well.
So
we sent it out to some of the community, regional offices, some industry, some consultants, and we suggested a deadline of January 17th, which is tomorrow. If you have I will be out of the office tomorrow though, and we are closed on Monday, so if I have it by next Tuesday morning, I'll start incorporating comments.
So a facility that right now, it's not in their permit, it's in the application, but it's kind of spread out.
Right.
So will everybody have to go in and then fill one of these out once it's issued, or is this, are they grandfathered in?
Yeah, but I guess it'll be whenever you come back in to do some changes at the facility that you would want to use any form that we currently are.
We'll say, oh, by the way, you need to fill this one out as well.
Right.
Okay.
Like the others. It's an application form for new permits and amendments. And this one is specifically for Type 1 and Type 1AE. There's a Type 4 that has been pushed to the side until we get through this one. It should be much simpler, obviously.
And on that note, we have another one coming, we're working on right now. It's not as a big ticket item for us, but, you know, we do see landfill mining every once in a while, but we're working on a landfill mining form right now, Type 9, to help provide consistency on what we see and when people submit those type of projects. So we're developing that right now. We're doing some internal staff review of it. Once we're done with that, we'll send that out for stakeholder comment as well. So look for that in the near future.
Steve, I was not clear on this. So is the intention that this would be completed and it would be in an attachment in the application, or would it be like a parallel document to ensure that
It would
all
not
the
be parallel.
Okay.
It should be part of the application. It would be an application document. So there would be no need for a separate waste acceptance plan in Part 2 of the application. This would provide for those rules.
Okay.
And it simplifies, you know, the things we're looking for. The limiting parameters is something I frequently NOD people for. This is essentially saying what we believe those limiting parameters should be and addressing the rules so we don't have to NOD it. There are opportunities in all the areas of, is there something else you need to tell us? But if you're a Type 1 landfill and have no Class 1 cell, 1,500 milligrams per kilogram TPH is a limiting parameter. So that's the sort of thing we need to hear, so we've just put it in.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions for my update? All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chance. And so now, Gene, I guess you're up to give us a little update on the scrap tire programs.
Good morning, members of the council. I'm Gene Mueller, section manager in the BPS section with the Waste Permits Division. I'm here to provide an update on the annual report call-in notice, and if time allows, hopefully provide a little scrap tire update, some perspective from the national level. So jumping into that, the annual report call-in notice. So the annual report is the report that our registered scrap tire transporters and registered scrap tire processors and storage facilities have to submit an annual report for the calendar year. So what we're looking at is 2019. So on January 14th, we mailed out approximately 534 letters to these transporters and processors and storage facilities, letting them know that they need to submit their report by March 1st. So their reports are due March 1st to us. And what we'll do then is we'll tabulate all that information, and that's where you've seen like the 2018 scrap tire annual report. That's where we're able to determine how many tires were managed in Texas during that calendar year, how those tires were, what the end uses were for those tires. So it generates that really nice annual report summary. So we tabulate all that information, and the time frame we're looking at is these reports trickle in starting this month all the way up to, you know, actually through March, even though they're due March 1st. But what our time frame typically is we'll go ahead and compile all that information and draft up the 2019 scrap tire annual report summary. We should have that done in around April, where we gather all the information, and then we should put on the web the final 2019 report sometime around June. So I'd say June of 2020, we should have that report out there. Some things to mention. We have made some improvements to the forms that the regulated entities fill out. So just use some more plain language. Figured out where the questions we've been receiving in the past and making sure to kind of address those questions within the form. We've also created a frequently asked questions section that we've added to our website that has about 7 frequently asked questions and some drop-down answers, so that should be helpful. And in the past, the letter didn't include the regulated entity's scrap tire registration number just because we were generating that, 534 letters. But we were able to do a mail merge, so now that number is on each individual facility's letter. So that should smooth things out because that was a question we got a lot. With that said, any questions on that annual report call-in notice? All right, good. We have time for what I think is the fun stuff. I was lucky enough to go to the 8th Annual Scrap Tire Recycling Conference. That's put on by the Scrap Tire Research and Education Foundation. So that was held in Greenville, South Carolina, and that was early December of last year, so just a little over a month ago. Greenville, South Carolina is home to a Michelin plant, and also South Carolina has several other tire manufacturers. I think BF Goodrich, there's Continental, GT. That state also has BMW auto manufacturer, Volvo auto manufacturer, and Mercedes-Benz, so some high-end auto manufacturers. What was really nice was that with that Michelin plant being there in Greenville, South Carolina. So at this conference, there was two main buzzwords, and they were circular economy and collaboration. Those were really the two main things. So starting on the circular economy idea, there's the U.S. Tire Manufacturers Association. So that group has all the tire manufacturers. So, Goodyear, BF Goodrich, Michelin, they're representing all these groups. And so their goal is 100%, sustainable tire economy, which would be the circular economy. So no longer a linear economy where tires are, produced, used, and then disposed of, but some way that those tires are continuously reused. With that circular economy idea, there was a group called Accenture, and they did some studies about, what consumers want, and it did identify that consumers had a strong view on the role of business and that they should be part of the solution. So this is kind of this evolving idea. I think we've seen it with electronics. We've seen it where people that are manufacturing the item should also think about what happens to that once it's reached its end of its life. There was an interesting idea where Michelin is actually looking at using tires like a product as a service. So this idea of a leasing program on tires, to where you would purchase your tire, utilize it, go back to the same place, give them that tire, and you get another tire. I thought that was quite interesting. What that also allows is the scrap tire recycling group definitely identified the challenges of receiving all sorts of different tires and how these tires have so many different products in them and manufactured in different ways. So this would allow Michelin to have control of their tires and then really to create a process that could utilize those tires and potentially make them back into new tires. I think a really interesting idea. The Volvo identified that they're currently using carbon black plastics in their cars, and that is something that is their goal, and they're doing it with purpose. And that's that idea, I think, of consumers holding manufacturers kind of responsible for finding end uses for things that they're generating. Some ideas about things that are being used. There was the State Materials Engineering Group out of Illinois. What's interesting about this, so this is about rubber modified asphalt. And with the rubber modified asphalt, there's been these processes, a wet process and dry process. Historically, you've heard about a wet process, and that's where they use the ground tire crumb rubber as actually the binding agent in the asphalt. So apparently there's some complications with that where it can get sticky, messy. And they're moving into this, there's now this what we call dry process, and that's where the ground rubber tires are used as aggregate, so they're more part of the aggregate proportion of the asphalt. And what was really interesting with this in Illinois is they're utilizing this for toll roads, so very high-speed roads. And this engineering group showed information that covered about 2014 to 2019, and you could definitely see all the way up through about 2017, it was all wet process. Then they started trying some of this dry process. And by 2019, all the contractors and all the people that were putting down the roads had switched to dry process, not because they were required to, but because it was a better process for them. How that ties into Texas is there is currently a Asphalt Plus LLC is doing some pilot projects with TxDOT, and actually our TxDOT Central District Office, so the one right here in Austin, where they're putting down some of these roads with this dry process. So I'm waiting to hear how that goes, but that is kicking off here in Texas. And it's definitely something exciting for us in the scrap tire program. We're hoping that that proves to be a very effective and useful use of tires, and then we'll see how that market grows. The U.S. Tire Manufacturers Association also went into tire-derived fuel, and the national perspective there, I like to just mention, they showed tire-derived fuel is definitely the major share of tire end use, and the national average is about 40%. Here in Texas, we're doing about 35%, but here's where things get a little interesting. With the tire-derived fuel, they have cement kilns, pulp and paper mills, and utility boilers are kind of the groups that use tire-derived fuel. In Texas here, it's I think approximately 7 cement kilns and then 1 facility that does recycled metal, and they use it more as a boiler, so more as a fuel. So, you know, the majority here is cement kilns. And where this gets interesting is the national perspective is they're seeing some challenges coming for tire-derived fuel. And at first that raised a lot of concern with me, but as I started identifying the challenges, there's a boiler MACT, maximum achievable control technology for air, that's coming online that could impact the boilers, you know, the facilities that are trying to utilize tires for fuel. There's also greenhouse gas rules that are coming along. And these facilities, these boilers and pulp mills are going to have to start looking at their carbon emissions as well as tire-derived fuel. But the national perspective, they said tire-derived fuel for cement kilns is still looking to increase, but tire-derived fuel use for boilers, so as energy, and tire-derived fuel use for the pulp and paper mills, both of those are expected to decline based on some of those challenges, in addition to, you know, fuel costs and things like that. But so I think we're somewhat insulated here in Texas from that national perspective just because of our cement kilns utilizing the tire-derived fuel. Jumping into collaboration and challenges, so this was interesting. The challenges, unfortunately Kevin isn't here, but Liberty Tire gave a good presentation identifying challenges of recycling tires. And maybe before I jump in those challenges, there was a group called Hall Partners LLC that went into this idea of what drives tire manufacturing. It's not, at this point, can you reuse this tire, can you recycle it? What drives it is sound dampening, self-cleaning tread, 80 to 90,000 K, you know, warranties, self-sealing, run flats, you know, those are the things that consumers want. So they're identifying, hey, when people are going in at these major tire manufacturers and building these tires and designing these tires, those are the things that are driving it. What's interesting, where Liberty Tire came in, is, you know, they're not being told about all these developments and new types of tires, and they have, you know, $1 million shredding equipment, and they ended up, you know, you throw in some of these run flats that now have this gel in there, gunks up their machinery, and that's just one tire that can gunk up the whole machinery. Something that anyone that's, you know, doing recycling is aware of. They're putting Kevlar in tires now. They had to do a whole, they had to recall a whole bunch of crumb rubber because the Kevlar wasn't shredding, so you were getting these sharp pieces poking out of the rubber, and it ruined a whole batch, and they had to recall a whole bunch of material. But there's these kinds of developments going on in tires that are going to create challenges on how do you process them, how do you insert them into the recycling economy. And it was something that I think Liberty would have some good information to share. But those are the challenges, and that was the idea of collaboration, that all these groups need to get together and work together. And U.S. Scrap Tire Manufacturers Association is going to be, I think, play a really major lead role in this, and we're currently in conversations with them. So just kind of wanted to provide that national perspective, because it was I spent 2.5 days there, and I find it extremely useful, so I'm happy to be able to just share some of that with y'all. Any questions?
Yeah, we've come a long way from just a single-ply tire to dealing with the radials and now the exotic materials they're putting in them. And I was curious, I don't know anything about the dry process, but I was just curious as far as, do we have the operations now in existence that can produce that kind of material, or is that going to require a whole nother industry to develop to produce the crumb rubber for the dry process?
That's they should be able to, generate the crumb rubber. Sometimes, as long as it's not micronized crumb rubber, that is where you freeze the rubber, drop it down like cryogenically, and then kind of shatter it or make it into really small fines. But we should have that capability, and what one of the benefits of the dry process too is they say on the, application side of things, it's minimal adjustments to your equipment. It's really, it's able to be added to the current machinery and application machinery and things like that, where it's just becoming part of the aggregate. So that's another benefit of it, and I think maybe why it caught on so well with the Illinois contractors.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, Gene, that was a great report. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Very, very insightful. Just going back to those comments that you made about Michelin, do you have any perspective on how pervasive that perspective is amongst the other tire companies? Could you get any kind of feel for that? And I know you talked about it a little bit, but just wanted to get some further insight from you there.
Yeah, that based on U.S. Scrap Tire Manufacturers Association, I mean, having that as a goal and recognizing that consumers are starting to expect that, we did, I believe, have someone from, it would have been, I think, BF Goodrich, that, also said that they're definitely on board with this and looking to see how can they create this circular economy for tires. So it's definitely on their radar, and they're working towards it. But I think what was interesting was that idea of that they still have to really pay attention to their consumers and what consumers want. And one thing they identified was, still, if you ask someone, do you want a tire that's been manufactured with other pieces of old tires? There's a lot, obviously, there's a lot riding on our tires. I mean, your family's safety, your own safety. And so they're still trying to maybe create a paradigm shift there. So that was still a challenge on just what consumers are willing to purchase. And it was an interesting mix where they there's one end that's showing how consumers are starting to, are holding these manufacturers accountable for not just manufacturing it and not caring if it ends up in a pile somewhere. But there was also that consumer part of what they want in their tire. So it's an interesting dynamic.
And Gene, you just said that you thought that the dry process that existed in Texas now, is that at the Genin plant, or is that at Genin and Baytown Liberty, or is that?
No, so there, I'll have to see where they receive. It's that the dry process has been used here, so where the contractor through that Asphalt Plus group was able to utilize that and put it down on a road here in Texas. I would have to check where they sourced that material. That I do not know.
Because at one time, and it may have changed, there wasn't a lot of crumb rubber being made in Texas. But again, as you mentioned, most of our recycling is for the kilns, right?
Yes, that's our highest one at about 35%.
But that was one of the targets when Genin built their big plant in East Houston. One of their targets was to go after the crumb rubber. But that plant was built, 7 years ago, 8 years ago? I bet it was set up as a wet process plant. I don't know, but that's just what I was wondering.
Well, Gene, if you recall, there was a contractor that came in a while back. They're doing a pilot somewhere in the Austin area. They're working with TxDOT.
Yeah, that's...
Well, no, that's what he said. It's being used. I'm asking, where's the source material coming from, and do we have? It's one thing to have the Texas Transportation Institute generate a ton or two of material in their lab for a demo, and it's another thing to say, all right, we're going to slap down 1,000 miles of road next year. Who's going to make the material, right?
Right. If I'm not mistaken, we'd have to check into it, but I thought the contractor was actually processing them themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I don't recall specifically. The source of the material.
Okay. Right.
Now, I know that for the micronized rubber, so where you're making this really fine granular material, that I don't believe that there is that ability in Texas. Those are other people that are generating it. Because I always ask, are you going to bring that technology to Texas if that type of rubber modified asphalt catches on in Texas? And typically it's like, as the market grows, you're not wanting to ship this stuff from Illinois or from far away. So that could drive that type of business growing within Texas. But it's we're at this first really important stage of apparently what it is, is TxDOT issuing specs. That's the huge thing, but they feel like this is coming a long way, and apparently it can move pretty fast. Now that they're laying down this roads with the Austin District Office, there's some things that can happen quite quickly where within the next couple years it could be more mainstream.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, that'd definitely be a generator if TxDOT did put it into their specifications, and suddenly, you start looking at, like Chuck said, 1,000 miles of highways in the state. That would generate a lot of interest from private industry. Great report, Gene. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next up, Mr. Santos Olivares, who's team leader with the Business and Program Services section. Give us a update on the regional solid waste management plans.
Good morning.
So let me back up a little bit.
Press your microphone button. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. So earlier, Earl spoke about the Fund 5000 and the $5.3 million a year that went out to the Council of Governments, all 24 of them, for them to use. And in that, they entered into contracts with the state, and part of those deliverables are developing projects, but also part of it is developing the regional solid waste management plan for their area. And so that's where they get the funding from. This year, or this coming next two bienniums, luckily, most of those plans from all 24 COGs are due. And part of this is due to back in 2002, the state developed a state solid waste management plan. That was a short-term 5-year plan, ran from 2001 to 2005, and the COGs were asked to revise their plans to make them consistent with that plan. The plan lasted for only 5 years. In 2003, the legislature, through House Bill 7 in the third special session, did away with that plan. And so due to that, we have most of the 24 COGs whose plans are going to be coming due between 2002 and 2003. And there's a couple that may be due a little earlier, and we have a couple who have come in the last year or so and had their plans revised. So that's kind of what we're working with here. The regional plan is an area-wide plan on solid waste management, how it's going to be handled in the area. There's 2 volumes for it. One is the overall plan, which we can say is kind of like the skeleton, the bones of the plan, and we refer to that as Volume 1. Volume 2 are the implementation guidelines, and that's where the COGs put the meat on the plan itself. Volume 1 looks at the geographic area, also their description on efforts to minimize for reuse and recycling. They include promoting waste minimization and public outreach. In that plan, again, Volume 1, the COG puts their commitment in there for encouraging cooperative efforts with local governments, local jurisdictions, also assessing the need for new disposal capacity, the transport of waste from one jurisdiction to another, and also allowing local governments to justify the need for a landfill in their area. Volume 2 then actually puts in, like I said, more of the implementation projects that are going to be, I don't want to say projects, but more of the implementation guidelines that they're going to be using. For this, they do an assessment of the area. They look at population growth patterns. They also look at current waste management systems and processes that are going on in their area. And finally, they also identify the process that they'll use to review proposed municipal waste landfills in their area and make sure they conform with the plan. Now, these are just a general guidelines or general requirements. There's a whole lot more, but these are kind of the highlights of what we'll be seeing. Like I said, most plans do expire in 2022. One of the things that we did this year when we entered into contracts with the 24 COGs is we included language in there to kind of start the ball rolling on the on developing the plans. And so our first critical timeline on that is that all the COGs have to submit a timeline with milestones of when they think they're going to accomplish developing of their plan, of their revised plan, their new plan, and that's due on April 30th here of this year in a couple of months. In that, once we get those plans, we're hoping that there's going to be milestones in there that are going to be able to allow us to better manage the development of all 24 COGs. We do want to have all of them approved by August 31st of 2022. For us to do that, we're pretty much looking at having them all in-house by January of 2022. We're looking at about 8 months process, which is going to include a general staff review, a technical review by Municipal Solid Waste, and then also a legal review to make sure that the plans do comply with the rules and also the statute. And so that's kind of a quick outline of our process and of what we're kind of waiting for and regarding to the plans. We will be working closely with all the COGs. We've already had some discussions with TARC as to how we can together manage this process. We're also have reached out to different council of governments to see where they are on their planning. And of course, we'll be setting up conference calls where all the COGs can come in and of course ask questions and get more detail on the process. So, any questions?
In the past, and just in certain locations, when the plans are written, there is a drive or a tendency or a desire sometimes to want to try to describe or designate where solid waste facilities can go through the use of setback distances and very well-meaning and intentioned items. I suspect that will be the case sometimes here, and I just offer as a reminder that the legislature has granted cities and counties legislative authority to designate where solid waste facilities can go, either via zoning in the cities or ordinances in the counties. I don't believe that they've authorized COGs to describe where solid waste facilities can go. They've authorized COGs to assist, provide guidance, all those things. But we have in the past had circumstances where well-intentioned setback distances, for instance, were laid out, and then when you got a GIS map, you found out that, in fact, no such area existed in the community. And I just offer as a caution to yourself and to the members of COGS that maybe try to stay within the authorized lanes that you have there.
That's why there is such a lengthy review process on the COGs that are submitted, just to look over all of the elements and just to ensure that the COGs meet the rule and or I'm sorry, not the COGs, but the plans. The plans meet the requirements of the statute and the rules.
Can I add to that? I mean, so we meet in February, all the COGs. I can't promise you that they won't do that, but I know most of my colleagues have talked, and we know what our plans are for, and that they aren't to decide where landfills go. So that's not the only, that's probably actually the least benefit of these plans, in my personal opinion. But I do make a personal commitment that I will try to work with the COGs to know what the requirements are and what is what they are and what they aren't. I've been doing this for a while, and there's new ones, and I think that they do turn to a lot of us who've been for a while for guidance, but not all COGS are created equal. However, the intent is always good, but the way it gets carried out is a little bit different. But I do make a personal commitment to try to help, and I know Tarek is working with us too.
I can say it, both as a city council member and as somebody who does land development for a living, restrictive zoning and things in that nature can sometimes, as Chuck stated, be well-intentioned, but when you overlay it on where it can actually, what land meets these definitions, it can be very limiting, and it becomes very difficult. I think on a broader perspective with respect to permitting any kind of facility with any kind of use, we want the process. What I try and advocate for in Pearland is we want the no to be as cheap as possible, and the yes can be expensive, but we got to give them a path forward. When we're creating rules that are difficult to interpret, constantly modified, and can generally lead to a path with no end, it's difficult for everybody and it's frustrating. So we need to be sorry for the term, but cognizant of the impacts as we develop. Also, if it's relevant, we had some discussions in the past about the permitting process associated with putting a landfill in an area where there's floodplain, and whether a LOMAR would be required. I don't know where we ever landed with that, if the legislature actually required that, but is that something that is monitored or looked at as we're doing site selection? And then what is the impact, I think, from the permitting side? Whatever ended up with that?
Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. That came up during a hearing. It still resides with FEMA in our agency. We review these applications. If any portion of the landfill is located or a proposed site is located in a floodplain, they are required to coordinate with their local floodplain administrator if they have one, as well as with FEMA, and get the approved CLOMR and LOMR through that process.
Only if the local floodplain administrator requires that, correct?
Right.
But
Right.
it didn't end up being a standard process to get a LOMAR as part of a permitting process.
Well, it's a condition of our permitting process, but it belongs to FEMA and the local floodplain administrators.
Fair enough.
And we look for that.
Look that they coordinated, but not
Right.
necessarily look that they applied for a letter of map revision.
Yes, so not every location has a coordinator, a local coordinator. In the absence of a coordinator for that area, they are still responsible for obtaining that letter of map revision from FEMA. That's the number one thing that we do. If there's a planner for that area, a local planner, that planner would need to sign that letter as well. That's what we require for that.
I think kind of in the same vein of site selection, I think maybe that's something we need to discuss, because I know there was some relatively robust debate about the necessity of that.
Now, there's a number of counties that have revisions to their area that they're waiting from FEMA to update those maps, and ultimately they're the answer that we're looking for from FEMA. I understand that. We have situations where there's outdated maps, and the county is trying to get FEMA to recognize that and update that. But ultimately, our statute, our rules require us to rely on FEMA for the answer to what that floodplain will be.
Okay. I don't want to bog down this conversation. I'd really like to continue to have that conversation, because I think it's well-intentioned, but it's excessively impactful and not really beneficial And it could really affect, site selection and really limit maybe what's a great, what I would say that you would want a landfill and that kind of use in land that's not extraordinarily valuable. Land that's not extraordinarily valuable has a tendency to coincide exactly where floodplain lands, because you don't want, that's very difficult to develop. You don't want to put buildings there, so.
That's been heavily discussed down at the legislature this past session.
Yeah.
At length.
And the COGS typically don't see those applications until it's already been reviewed and vetted by TCQ staff. So at that time, they've already, I think, addressed a lot of those concerns. And then the COG reviews that to see if it's in compliance with their overall plan, if I'm not mistaken. One other question.
We're not engineers.
One other question I had was, so we saw the chart of how much money the COGS are going to get for their grant projects. Is the money to pay for this going to have to come out of that, or is it going to be a separate check written to pay for these updates?
No, right now the funding that was allocated out to all 24 counties or 24 COGS will have to be part of that funding. Will have to be used for the development of these plans, and that's one reason why we've have provided both fiscal years 20 and 21 and 22 and 23 available for use of that funding.
Okay, well, and then the other thing, so I work with a couple of solid waste advisory councils, and kind of what I was hearing through those meetings was that these are just going to be limited updates to the original plan. Those original documents in some cases were 3 and 4 inch thick volumes, sometimes 2 and 3. And what I've been hearing through those meetings is that, no, it's just going to be a small document.
Some of our discussions with some of the COGS have we've learned that as well. And so, again, we're just working with them just to make sure they've covered all elements of the requirements and have updated that pertinent information to include in the plan.
Let me add something. This is my first cycle with these plans coming in. I guess the original ones were some time back. 1994. Right, so they're just coming in for renewal.
The first one was due 1994, or that's when we started ours. And then, as Santos mentions, we were all required to redo them and change the formats to volumes 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm going to be working with my staff on is to come up with some general prescribed forms that, dictate or provide you with guidance on what information we're going to look for and where. Otherwise, we're going to have 24 different plans, and that's going to take a while to review those. So I would like to come up with some guidance, and I'm looking at Jenny right now. We'll be glad to come to one of y'all's future meetings and kind of lay that out, what we're expecting.
Santos, I think, is already coming to TARC in February. The main thing, I think, for the COGS, because there are a lot of new people, is what the plans are and what they aren't. And also the reason I'm a planner by, that's my job, my master's in. However, these plans are a little bit different than some other traditional plans because they're reviewed by the commission and it takes such a long process. They do need to be sort of bare minimums. We have our own other tools to help direct our policy, and that doesn't have to be approved by the commission. So these really need to look at what the intent of them for. We can go and do our own strategic plans outside of this particular solid waste management plan. And so since these do have to be by the commission, they need to be sort of lean and mean and just really hit the bare bones. Otherwise, you're stuck after 3 years if you want to amend that plan because you have to go back through the commission. And usually the TCQ hasn't had that set in their work plan. So, we all have to keep that in mind, that what the intent of these plans are for.
Right. Cheryl, that's a very good point. And if you don't mind, we may reach out to you as we're in the development of those forms and work with you on that.
Santos is already.
Yeah.
That sounds great, Jenny. I don't know if y'all heard that, but Jenny with the Texas Association of Regional Councils saying that they could develop a work group to work with the agency on developing a format for those. Because otherwise it's going to take us a significant amount of time to review 24 different plans and we won't meet the deadlines.
Well, and I think that's the other issue is that like I said, I started hearing this actually before Christmas. and hearing one thing, and I'm kind of hearing something a little bit different here this morning. So when was that TARC meeting? February 5th? February.
Yeah.
Oh, lock them in for 3 days, huh? And that's here in Austin?
Yes.
I think that'd be a good time to get everybody on the same page. See anything, anybody else have a question for Santos? Right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Got your work cut out for you going forward.
Thank you.
Okay, we are now up with Ryan Rutledge, Supplemental Environmental Project Specialist. Good morning, Ryan.
Morning. My name is Ryan Rutledge. I'm a staff attorney with the Litigation Division of the Office of Legal Services here at TCEQ. I do enforcement work for representing with the Executive Director for enforcement cases, and at least part-time, I'm a SUP attorney, which is what I'm here talking to you guys for, so I'm glad to be invited with the committee members. It's nice to be in this room, not being grilled by the commissioners for the enforcement docket. So, I'm going to make sure this works. Okay. So hopefully you all will have access. This presentation is available on our website, incidentally, in case you want to have access to these links and contact numbers. I want to try and get through these. This is usually a two-person presentation, but we recently lost one of our SUP coordinators that handles the respondent side, so my apologies in advance. This is what we're going to talk about, what SEPs, SEP offsets, the types of SEPs and third-party administrators, and then just end with the contact information and standard info. As many of you all know, respondent is an entity that's in violation of TCEQ rules or Texas law, or at least we think they are. The respondent is an entity regulated by TCEQ, individuals, governments, nonprofits. An agreed order is an agreement between the TCEQ and said respondent in which the respondent agrees to pay a penalty and come into compliance. So an environmental enhancement project that offsets an administrative penalty in an enforcement matter. What's that all about? Well, the purpose is to prevent pollution, reduce, enhance, and contribute. This is based off of the Water Code. So this is in statute 7.067B2. Now, it's important to remember that whenever someone's contributing to, or at least considering contributing to a SEP through their agreed order, as opposed to paying towards the general revenue, the type of violations they have will have an impact in terms of what third-party administrators on the other side of it might potentially be eligible to receive their funds. So air violations go to air SEPs. In almost all instances, there are some unique circumstances where they could potentially go. And then water and waste can commingle. So if there's a water violation, they can choose a third-party administrator that otherwise does waste third-party administrator projects. So what is a community? Projects that benefit the community in which the alleged violation occurred. Well, these are the levels of community: city, county, where the river basin, the aquifer, the air control region, obviously for air cases. You've probably seen these maps before. Gives you an idea of levels of community. Well, that's important because the whole point is if you have a violator out of Houston, unless you have a third-party administrator that operates statewide, which we do have a couple of those, and they're very good, you typically would want to have them to choose a third-party administrator that benefits their community. Well, that could be the city of Houston, or that could be the region that they're in, if it's an air control region or water, all the way to a river basin. So as opposed to a violator of Houston and then some third-party administrator that does cleanup in El Paso, well, that's not helpful to the people of Houston. So a SEP offset. Respondent may perform or contribute to a SEP in lieu of paying an assessed penalty to the General Revenue Fund. And so SEP credit is earned. Performing a compliance or custom SEP, and I'll get more specifically as to what the difference between those are, or contribute to a third-party administrator SEP. SEPs do not reduce the penalty amount. And this is very important. It's why it's in bold with all those exclamation points. We're not a grant program, unfortunately. So the respondent picks the third-party administrator, if that's what they choose to do on the SEP, and we just give them the list. It's on the website. We can't actually lobby or encourage them to choose a specific third-party administrator, although we do have to tell them, hey, you know, if you're an air violator, you need to choose one of these air SEPs, but from this list, and we just leave it at that. But there's not a war chest of money lying around like a CDBG grant or any of those things that you typically, you know, might be used to. And that sometimes is a bit difficult when you're having potential third-party administrators who are submitting applications to propose a project, saying, hey, well, we're interested in this grant program. Like, well, funding's not guaranteed. There's not a grant program. Someone has to choose you. And I'll get into that. So types of organizations, corporations, individuals, and then local governments and nonprofit organizations. Those types of organizations are distinctive specifically on the potential third-party administrator side, which will make sense here in a little bit. And of course, environmental benefit, we have direct, indirect, and mixed. A typical example would be, well, if you have a tire cleanup with an educational component to it, you might have a third-party administrator, an approved third-party administrator might facilitate a tire cleanup in a given area wherein, at least as part of the program, before the cleanup occurs, they try and educate the folks who are participating in the tire cleanup event, which is funded through the funds that they receive from the respondent through their settlement agreement. So that would be a mixed benefit. Now, it's important to note that you cannot be a third-party administrator that only does educational or research. There has to be a measurable environmental benefit. And the only way to do that is if you have that cleanup. But there can be an educational component to it. These are some of the percentages, so direct benefit. So for offset amounts, this will make more sense when we talk about compliance SEPs and about 100% offsets. So just keep that in mind, but it'll make more sense here shortly. Compliance SEPs, or CSEPs for short, local government only. That's really important, and it'll make sense as to why. Custom SEPs are very, very rare. They're typically not very attractive to, well, certainly not to local governments because of the compliance SEP option, and very rarely to public or nonprofit because there's a very quick timeline turnarounds, and it can typically be more expensive for them to customize a SEP that they're proposing as part of the program than it would be to just contribute to a third-party SEP that's already in existence, that's been approved by TCEQ. And it's important we tell them if you're going to do custom SEP, assuming it's even approved, which it very well may not be, any additional costs that the project overruns SEP funds can't be used for that. So that clears up the process pretty quickly, I can promise you. So the commission may consider a respondent's willingness to contribute to a SEP that is approved by the commission, giving preference to the projects that benefit the community. That's the measurable environmental benefit we're talking about, in which the alleged violation occurred. The commission may not approve a project that is necessary to bring a respondent into compliance with the environmental laws that they were alleged to have violated. And then you see this asterisk there, of course, right? Well, compliance SEP. The commission may approve a SEP that is necessary to bring a respondent, that's a local government, into compliance with environmental laws that is necessary to remediate the environmental harm caused by the respondent's alleged violation, if they're an LG. So that's a defined term, so here are the local governments. And that will, as you'll see in a graph here towards the end of the presentation, has a pretty significant effect on the availability of funds going forward. We felt the impact of this on the funding side over the last few years, and you'll see for yourself as to how that is. But it does make sense. I think the train of thought was, these local governments who, especially the smaller ones, who may not be able to get, good operators or people who are trying to do the thing, staying, up to date with the rules and regs. They're not only having to pay the penalty assessed by the TCEQ, but then on top of that penalty that goes to the general revenue fund, they're having to then also pay extra to get actually into compliance, which is a burden on their local tax base, which may not be in a good position to suffer that burden. So The Texas legislature decided to try and give them some relief on that end. And it has been beneficial to that extent, although there are impacts which you'll see here shortly. So 2 paths to a CSEP, automatic or financially qualified, that used to have a little bit more bearing. Most CSEP, the vast majority of CSEPs are automatic because they meet the statutory requirements of that. And they're performed by the LG as part of the TCQ agree order. They're proposed. The project is submitted as a separate form attachment A to their proposed agreed order. And then, of course, the enforcement docket that well, we had one yesterday actually here, where it's approved, one hopes, by the commission, along with a whole bunch of other agreed orders and defaults. And of course, there's a need for corrective action. There has to be a need for corrective action. The LG has not, for automatic CSEPs, the LG has not previously committed a violation at the same site with the same underlying cause in the preceding 5 years as documented in the order. So this is done for obvious reasons, right? So you don't want an LG to dip into the cookie jar too many times within the same 5-year period, because we're giving them the benefit of using those funds to fix their problems. Now, those are problems that are like, oh, we need a new generator or whatever. It can't, but it can't be used for human error. So if someone decided not to show up to work that day, that's not going to fly. Sorry. And did not agree before the date the commission initiated the enforcement action to perform the project. We're pretty flexible when it comes to, look, if a TCQ investigator went out there, identified some problems, and then the LG started working to fix them after they got the exit interview form, or potentially even a little bit later on, the notice of enforcement, we're not going to then wag our fingers and say, oh, this was before we approved your agreed order. Now, if they agree to do that as part of an approval process through another state agency or grant program, we're not going to let them double dip. So that's where that comes in. The LG does not qualify for an automatic CSEP and must undergo a financial assessment if it's the financially qualified CSEP. So this is anyone else who does not fall into the automatic CSEP bucket would go into here. I can't even remember the last time that someone didn't qualify for an automatic CSEP and had to undergo a financial assessment. So theoretically, if you had someone who otherwise did not qualify for the reasons that we stated in automatic CSEPs, if they've done it a couple times or whatever, and that we're maybe in a 4-year period, at least there's a process by which maybe there's a financial burden that they really need to be assessed in order to then otherwise qualify for CSEP. It's there. It's not utilized very often, but it is there just in case. So CSEPs repair structures or equipment that may be the cause of the LG's noncompliance with an environmental law or remediation of environmental harm caused by LG's alleged violation, such as cleanup of a spill. Custom SEPs performed by the respondent as part of a TCQ good order project's most considered direct quantifiable benefit to the environment. Projects must be fully completed within 365 days from the effective date of the AO to earn the SEP credit. That can be a tall order depending on the violations. So that's one of the reasons why most people don't choose these anymore. Although some, like one common example would be you have a cleanup for cities that might do cities used to do custom SEPs a little bit more for voluntary cleanup, where you have TV pickup days or something like that, but obviously they usually choose customs or compliance SEPs at this point. Failure to complete a custom SEP will result in the respondent paying the entire assessed penalty in addition to whatever funds were already spent on the project. So this is just really exciting, right? Custom SEPs usually cost more than the assessed penalty. Again, this is just screaming, hey, I really want a custom SEP, guys. SEPs must be accepted prior to any feasibility study, budget discussion, planning, implementation. Information gathering is okay, though. Types of custom SEPs extend first-time water service to low-income residents, sewer service, low-income residents, dam repairs, collection events like we were talking about earlier, and erosion control projects on creek, river, lake with a natural embankment, photos and maps. Beautification and flood control projects are not considered erosion control projects. So people who propose these great custom SEPs where they're going to plant a lot of bushes, sorry. Typical reporting documents required for compliance in custom SEPs. Now, this is done for the reasons stated there: transparency, transparency, transparency. The SEP program is a program that is audited, so we need to be able to demonstrate the logs and expenses and that they match the custom SEP that was approved by the commission. And this goes to third-party administrators as well, on the third-party administrator side, which we'll get to. SEPs will not cover administrative costs or organizational's operating costs, including expense reports, handling of finances, project coordination liability, or equipment breakdowns. Electronic collection events, so that was one of the examples of custom SEPs. There's another one here. There's additional information on the website through links and stuff. These are just past events. Wastewater projects. Looks really good. Okay, the good stuff. Third-party administrator SEPs. Third-party SEPs are performed by a LG or nonprofit organization that has a SEP agreement with TCEQ are called third-party administrators. So this would be the other side of the coin. You had your respondents who got into trouble, chose a type of SEP. Let's say they chose a third-party administrator from the list, said, I'm going to use a portion of my funding to go to part of the general revenue and then part to a third-party administrator who will perform, who's designated and approved to perform a certain project. And then you, as a third-party administrator, hopefully you're lucky enough you got chosen, and they cut the check directly to you. It doesn't go through TCEQ. Types of third-party SEPs: cleanup projects, air projects, water quality projects, habitation restoration, preservation, and acquisition projects. So habitation restoration, that's occasionally attractive for folks who want to do native species protection and things of that nature, and like when there's an invasive species, especially around the coast. LG or nonprofit organization submits an application to become a third-party administrator. The TCEQ reviews and submits and if approved, a SEP agreement is executed. The project is included in the pre-approved list, which is on the website. Anyone can see it. On SEP website available for contributions from respondents. Contributions are voluntary, then there's no guarantee of funding. Anytime a potential third-party administrator calls in, those are usually the first words I say, and that kind of weeds out some of them. They're like, oh, there's not a grant program and there's no guarantee of funding. Oh boy. Respondent contributes allowable SEP offset amount to third-party administrator within respondent's community. We talked a little bit about what we mean by community. Only after a SEP has been approved by the commission, they do not pay early. Now, they could, on the respondent side, of course, they can start doing their technical requirements, but they wouldn't necessarily cut the check until we agreed, oh yeah, you can cut the check to this third-party administrator. Third-party administrator must have separate fee-free and non-interest-bearing bank account for all SEP funds. I can't stress this enough, and for reasons that are obvious, no commingling of funds. These things are tracked by the SEP coordinators and must pay vendors from SEP bank account. Occasionally you have folks who have additional grant monies, other revenue sources, primary revenue sources, and you'll understand why I say primary here as opposed to funding from SEPs. And they try and put it all in one account. Well, they're getting into trouble with us, and hey, we can't be commingling funds. This is SEP money only. And I would imagine, on the grant side, whoever's giving them grant money, they have their own rules for them not to want to commingling those funds. So there's that. Third-party administrator performs the SEP and reports quarterly to the TCEQ. There's no other obligation from the respondent, incidentally. So once the order's approved and they cut the check, their dishes are kind of done. They don't have to worry about it, and for good reason, because we want to make sure that they get the funding and then they're kind of out of it. And for that reason, we strongly disencourage payment plans on the third-party administrator side. So if the respondent gets in trouble and they want to do a payment plan for the funding that's otherwise going to the general revenue fund through agreed order, we can work with them all day long. But for the 50% portion that would otherwise go to the third-party administrator, we want all the funding up front, and for good reason, because we want the third-party administrator who's approved to do certain projects, we don't want them to presume that they're going to get funds, in this quarter or over the next 3 years. We want them to be able to effectuate their projects with some degree of efficiency. Third-party administrator quarterly reports include identifying whether SEP contributions have been received, identify whether SEP funds are being spent timely within 1 year. Obviously, there's some rolling deadlines, and depending on the third-party administrator's itemized budget, so things might roll over from year to year. But as long as they're reporting and showing, that if they said they spent money for this thing, that they're showing that. Reasonable extensions are available, of course, and this is usually not a problem. Ensure SEP expenditures are allowable under the SEP agreement, and to verify that SEP funds are not being commingled with non-SEP funds. Documentation required. You've already seen this list from the respondent side. We want to make sure that everything that they say they spent it on matches what is actually being spent on. Types of allowable expenses: supplies, materials, equipment, and contract labor. Now, this is a little bit different on the third-party administrator side. Types of allowable administrative costs. 10% or less of the direct cost of the project is allowed, including salary and fringe benefits, travel and per diem, and overhead costs. This is important to stress, though. Anyone who's a potential third-party administrator, they can't presume that they're going to get these allowable administrative costs. This has to be listed in their proposed project application in their itemized budget. They need to have it in the budget. If it's not in the budget, you ain't getting it. So current third-party administrators, this is just a list. Some of the names you might recognize: Texas RC&D. They're one of the folks that they have statewide implementation, and they're a fantastic partner. Galveston Bay Foundation, Houston Galveston Aeroco. Yeah, you can see the complete list for that link. There's some of the. There's the Armand Bayou one. I didn't take these pictures, so don't blame me if they're a little bit fuzzy. I understand that was a pretty good project. So, okay. Take note of these slides. Total administrative orders 2018-2019. Obviously, there's ebbs and flows from year in to year out. Sometimes enforcement cases take a while before it finally gets settled. But here's some examples of the numbers. Administrative orders with SEPs. You have your penalties, and then you have the much smaller number. Now, it's key to keep in mind that, say, from last year, the $2.7 million, that includes compliance SEP money. So for local governments who chose to use the money that would otherwise have gone to the general revenue fund, or theoretically a third-party administrator, had they chosen that third-party administrator SEP route, they're using that as in the compliance SEP to fix their own problems. So that's actually not going anywhere. So there's a not insignificant percentage of that $2.7 million is non-third-party administrator funds that are allocated to those approved TCQ projects. Well, why is that important? It's important because it's probably more reasonable to consider potential SEP funding, if you're a potential third-party administrator, as a potential supplemental funding source to other more primary funding sources, because you just look at the list of third-party administrators. Everyone's feeding out of the same trough for a very, very low amount of money. Now, before compliance SEPs, that number was significantly larger, but there you have it. So if someone calls in and submits an application to do a 20-year, $15 million restoration project, I say, well, in 100 years from now, when that project gets completed, I'm sure it'll be fantastic. We are currently in the process, because we are aware of the funding limitations and the trends that we're seeing. We're currently in the process of assessing the application screening process, so the third-party administrator screening process. We're looking at different factors. If we're really going to approve this project to add to an ever-growing list, do we want to be a little bit more we exercise a little bit more discretion, which is allowed under the statute, to approve a project that would just add to a growing list, a list that includes folks like Texas RC&D that have established connections with contractors and various people that do really great work. It's important for us to really at least consider that, but we're still, it's only January. We're kind of looking at that right now, so who knows when this settles, where that's going to go. So there's my contact information. Betty Sanders is relatively new to the program. She's not new to the agency, but she's new to the program. And we usually have 2 SEP coordinators in the litigation division. We're currently, staffing up after we lost someone back in October. They went to they're still with the agency, but they're in a different section. And then there's another SEP coordinator in the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. So obviously, as you might well know, if someone gets in trouble on the respondent side, they first go through the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. Now, a vast majority of them settle through that, but in those that they just really want to litigate, well, then they come to me. So, and leave a lot of money on the table because we can't give them deferrals. So there you have Stu Beckley's contact information. So I hope that was illuminating, and I'm open to, I know by the time I got up here, we were running late on time. So any questions or comments on that?
Thank you, Ryan. I think the underlying message is try to stay away from Ryan. At what point, so that, I was curious, at what point are you brought into the program then, when they finally reach a point with compliance and enforcement that this isn't getting anywhere, that's when you get brought into the
yeah, if you want to look at the timeline, if we're talking about the enforcement side, obviously, someone gets in trouble on the regional level, it could be 18 months if they go through the whole process before we see the case.
Right.
So, because they would have to go through the region, and the region, if they can't, through the exit interview form and the notice of enforcement or the notice of violation, depending on the situation, then if they still like, oh, we're not we don't agree, like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to send you an angry letter and send you the enforcement division. Okay, enforcement division, and you're like, hey, well, you're going to settle with us. Here's a proposed agreed order. I'm like, well, okay, well, maybe not. Well, what are you going to do if I don't? Well, we'll send you an angry letter and we'll send you these other guys, and then most people settle there. And then if it comes to us, so like, well, what are you? It's like, I'm Ryan Rutledge, the litigation division. Well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to sue you. Wait, what? So, there you have it.
Well, great. Does anyone else have any questions for Ryan?
I had a quick question. I first saw SEPs about 15, 20 years ago, environmental enforcement cases, and so, monies would be used, saw some good projects. Did I just see something recently in a trade journal, or was like Wall Street Journal that EPA was potentially limiting some of how SEPs could be used? I thought something I just read recently, it could be changed.
Yeah, that doesn't really have the impact that it might sound like it is for a third-party administrator, because we very rarely typically see that type of in that context. But we did take note of that, but it really doesn't. We took a look at under what circumstances that would even come up as an issue. Like, for instance, for someone who didn't choose a SEP through the enforcement process, or potentially even the litigation process a little bit later, and then referred over to the Office of the Attorney General. The Office of the Attorney General might, as part of and they might have some federal parts of it, they might try and have an agreement in which part of it goes to SEPs, potentially, and that happens so rarely as to not really have much, at least in Texas, for Texas agencies, happens so rarely that it didn't really, we don't anticipate an impact on that, but yeah.
So that's more at the federal level than the state level?
Yeah, that's where you would typically see that, because the type of violators that we deal with that actually choose SEPs are, well, the vast majority would be compliant SEPs at this point, right? So it makes sense for them, and that would very rarely have the component that would trigger EPA to get off. So.
And last question, what if it's Clean Water Act issue in Texas? Is that federal or state?
Well, we would have, there might be a violation of the Texas Water Code, which obviously that would be a state scenario. Now, there might be some overlap where if because of the nature of Texas, I guess it's more of an issue in other states where you just have a substantial amount of territory of the state that's federally owned, and we just don't see that here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That it? All right.
Anyone else? Thank you, Ryan. Okay, well, we're going around third, headed toward home. So I think we're at a point now to, I think everyone in your packet should have the meeting minutes from our October 10th, 2019 meeting. And if you haven't had a chance to look those over, I'll give you a moment or two, and then when somebody's ready, I would take a motion to accept the minutes either as read or with any corrections.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept the minutes as presented.
Second. Got a motion by Mr. Wolverton and a second by Mr. Pitts. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
So approved. Next one is any action items. Didn't see a list, so I don't think we have any, do we, Diane? Okay. No action items, then we'll move ahead to open the floor for public comments. So anyone in the public would like to address the council, feel free to come up to the podium. Good morning. And just state your name and your affiliation again, please.
Barbara Coombs. And I may need to get more informed on whether there is a consistent measurement for diversion in the state of Texas. But I'm concerned that there's pressure to measure diversion as the total amount of recyclables as a percentage of your total waste stream. And you just need to know that we need to learn from other states' mistakes. Texas can be stubborn, but we're not stupid. The state of California in 2010 passed SB 1016, which measures garbage per capita as a way of measuring diversion. It's much cleaner and it's easier to implement. You don't have to measure all your recyclables. The recycling industry is having a terrible time right now, and the pressure to have them have to monitor and measure all these materials, and it causes double counting and just trouble. So also water conservation is measured as gallons per capita, and water used is gallons per capita. So garbage per capita would be an equivalent measurement. That's just my primary concern.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Combs?
TCEQ is already measuring garbage per capita, and we just need to refine it a little bit. Recently, on reviewing the 2018 summary, it looked like Waco had been hit by a hurricane similar to Beaumont. And what happened, actually, if you go into the detail, is that Itasca landfill, hello, Tony, is bordering the Dallas area. So so Itasca is at the upper corner of COG 11, and so all that garbage is being allocated toward COG 11 when actually it's bordering Johnson County and Ellis County. So just a little tweaking would make it a lot easier and cleaner. And it also brings it into individual accountability where individuals recognize, wow, we're at 10 pounds per person per day. And it incentivizes the individual at an individual level to recycle or do waste minimization practices. Where when you tell them, wow, we recycled 6 million tires, they can't get their head around that. But you tell them we're double the national average. Instead of 4.2, we're at 7.6. That's gonna, Texas can do better. Oklahoma's at 6. I mean, it'll create more incentive if we move to garbage per capita instead of measuring diversion as all your recyclables. And many states are not doing it anymore. Even according to RETRAC, when they had their conference in Tennessee, they said, the attendees said, this information isn't published for 4 years. And nobody's using it. If we used it, we would have avoided the green sword. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to address the council? Well, great. Finished just a little after noon. So if there's no further business before the advisory council, I will announce our next meeting will be April the 9th, 2020 in this room at 10 a.m. And we are adjourned. Thank you.